What if survival itself demanded a price more brutal than death, demanded a woman surrender her pride, her body, her very sense of liberty in return for safety in the savage wilds? In the Texas frontier, the world is carved by the lonely, claimed by the strong, and shaped by bargains no civilized soul would ever offer. Picture a widow, stripped of every comfort but her child and a rusted rifle, standing in the shadow of a rancher whose law is the only shelter for miles. What happens next isn't romance. It's a war of wills, a reckoning of hearts, and a fight for a future that won't be handed over easily. Listen now, and you will learn what it means to be claimed, to fight for every drop of warmth, and to forgive the darkness inside the ones who save us. Before you turn away, hit subscribe. Here, stories keep you, and you're never alone. Evelyn Parker gazed at earth turned brittle and white, the Texas night pressing against her back like a living predator. Just hours ago, she'd buried her husband William beneath a cross hacked out of wagon wood, the last symbol of a family broken by men who wanted only to take. Their dreams of land, cattle, and a life shaped by honest labor had scattered with a gunshot and the cries of a boy now clutching her skirts. Her 6-year-old Eli was the only reason she kept moving, though every breath felt like swallowing ice shards. The bandits had come at dawn 3 days prior, their faces masked with kerchiefs, their intentions written in the gleam of drawn steel. William had fought with the desperation of a man protecting everything precious to him, his rifle cracking against the morning silence. But there had been too many, and when the smoke cleared, their wagon train was scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Bodies lay still in the frost, supplies looted, horses stolen. Evelyn had hidden beneath their overturned wagon with Eli pressed against her chest, his small mouth covered by her trembling hand to muffle his terrified sobs. Now, with nothing but a dented pot, a bag of cornmeal, and William's rifle, she faced the most impossible choice of her life. Panic, not purpose, drove her through the snow that cut like broken glass against her face. William had spoken of Dusty Creek, a town somewhere beyond Coyote Ridge, at least 20 miles west through terrain that could swallow them whole. She had no maps, no horse, no guide, but the fading tracks of other wagons and the cruel indifference of the Texas winter. Wolves circled the lonely places, their eyes glinting like stars fallen to earth. She wrapped Eli tighter in every scrap of fabric she could salvage, told him old tales of heroes and warm fires, but the cold found every secret weakness in their bones. His lips had turned blue hours ago, his questions fading to whimpers that broke her heart with each passing mile. The rifle felt heavier with each step, her fingers too numb to work the trigger even if death showed its face. All night she listened for hope, for God, for anything but the unceasing wind that seemed to mock every prayer she whispered. Eli shivered into silence, his small body growing frighteningly still against her chest. With bleeding hands, Evelyn built a weak fire from frozen twigs and dried grass, the flames so pitiful they barely cast light beyond her outstretched arms. She prayed it would keep death at bay, but even she knew the fire would die before morning, and with it, any chance of seeing another sunrise. In the deepest hour before dawn, when the cold pressed closest, and the wolves sang their hunger to the stars, a shadow broke the storm. A figure massive and silent, moving with the confidence of one who had mastered both cattle and desolation, emerged from the white darkness like something carved from the very bones of the frontier. Caleb Morgan was known from river to ridge as a rancher whose rules were as unyielding as barbed wire and whose mercy was as scarce as rain in August. His hands, scarred from rope and horn and the countless small violences of frontier life, told stories of loss no man should endure. His face, weathered to leather and blank as stone, revealed nothing of the heart that still beat beneath layers of grief and isolation. Those dark eyes studied Evelyn and Eli not with pity, but with the cold calculation of a man who had learned to measure everything in terms of survival. He stood over them, boots planted firm in the frost, his presence both shelter and threat. When he spoke, His voice carried the slow, soft rumble of distant thunder, dredging up fears Evelyn had tried to bury beneath desperation. "You won't survive another night," Caleb said, unhurried and certain as winter itself. "Wolves'll have you before the cold does. Or maybe the cold'll take you first. Either way, you're dead." His gaze moved from Evelyn's trembling form to Eli's blue lips and back again. "Let me claim you. You feed my fire, warm my bed, raise my sons, and keep my name alive. Refuse, and nothing in these plains will save you from what's coming." Evelyn's spine stiffened despite the numbing cold, her fingers clutching the rifle with the last of her strength. Every instinct screamed against this devil's bargain. Every memory of her mother's teachings about virtue and propriety rose up in rebellion. But Caleb didn't flinch from her defiance, didn't retreat or soften his offer. If anything, his certainty grew stronger. "Town's a week away in good weather," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Maybe more in this storm. You got no food for that journey, no shelter, no guide through country that kills men twice your size with twice your experience. My way's the only way that ends with both of you breathing tomorrow." Years of carefully maintained virtue warred against the brutal reality of Eli's need. Tears froze to salt crystals on her cheeks as she judged the truth in the stranger's words and found it unassailable. Her child mattered more than pride, more than the old codes of decency her mother had drilled into her heart. Eli's lips had gone from blue to white, his eyes closing with the terrible stillness of approaching death. The choice, when it came, tasted like ashes and salvation combined. "Will come," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. She handed over her fate, not in surrender, but in the bitter necessity of a mother who would trade everything, her body, her freedom, her very soul, for one more day of her child's laughter. Caleb wasted no words on gentleness or false comfort. He swept up their pathetic bundle of possessions as if they weighed nothing and turned into the storm, his massive form cutting a path through drifts that would have buried them both. Evelyn stumbled behind, Eli's limp weight growing heavier with each step, her legs trembling with exhaustion and the terror of what she had agreed to. The journey felt endless, each step a test of her resolve to keep moving. The rancher moved with the sure-footed grace of a predator in his own territory, never slowing, never looking back to see if she could match his pace. When she stumbled and nearly fell, he caught her arm with surprising gentleness, but his eyes held no warmth, only the practical concern of a man protecting valuable property. The ranch emerged from the pre-dawn gloom like a fortress carved from the very bones of Texas, timber walls rising stark against the pale sky, barbed wire glinting like spider's silk in the growing light, livestock huddled in pens that spoke of prosperity earned through blood and toil. Inside the main house, animal pelts draped the walls like the ghosts of vanquished enemies, and the scent of smoke and leather hung heavy as the memory of grief itself. Eli was placed beside a roaring fireplace without ceremony, his small body finally beginning to show signs of life as warmth crept back into his frozen limbs. Evelyn's meager supplies were deposited on a rough wooden table, inventoried with the efficiency of a man who knew the value of every grain of salt and scrap of cloth. Caleb's rules manifested in every glance, every gesture, every word that fell from his lips like commandments carved in stone. "You work, you eat, you live," he told her, his voice carrying the finality of natural law. "The boy gets warmth and food because he's young and innocent of the world's cruelties. You get the same because you're mine now, bought with shelter and paid for with service. Run, and the wolves'll finish what the cold started. This is my land, and here you'll be mine until I have sons to carry my name." Evelyn burned with humiliation and necessity, her pride writhing against the chains of circumstance, but she did not speak back. To argue was to risk everything she had traded her freedom to protect. Instead, she learned the rhythm of captivity, disguised as salvation. She washed dishes until her hands cracked and bled, cooked meals from provisions that seemed endless compared to their recent starvation, patched fences with wire that cut her fingers and left scars that would never fade. Eli, restored by heat and food and the simple miracle of safety, began to ask questions and explore the boundaries of their new existence. The rancher kept his word with the mechanical precision of a man who understood that promises, once made, were sacred as debt. Food appeared regularly, shelter remained solid against every storm, but affection was never offered. Caleb's gaze reminded Evelyn constantly of the bargain she had struck, the price she had yet to fully pay. As nights crawled by and storms worsened, wolves pressed closer to the house, their howls a constant reminder of the death that waited just beyond the circle of firelight. Sometimes, in the deepest cold, when the wind threatened to tear the roof from its moorings, she and Eli would climb into a pile of buffalo robes near the hearth, Caleb's massive body serving as a bulwark between them and the savage wild. The intimacy was born of necessity, not desire, but it softened something in the rancher's granite features that Evelyn filed away for future understanding. The rules were as harsh as the land that spawned them, carved from the kind of pragmatism that kept men alive when civilization was just a memory. Evelyn's pride suffered daily small deaths, but Eli grew stronger with each passing week. She told herself that was enough, that pride was a luxury mothers couldn't afford when their children's lives hung in the balance. One night, during a blizzard that seemed determined to erase the very memory of warmth from the world, Evelyn found herself pressed against Caleb for heat. Eli curled between them like a bridge spanning the gulf between desperation and salvation. In the intimate darkness, surrounded by the sounds of wind and flame, she whispered the question that had haunted her since their first meeting. Why here? Why alone? The words came out broken, barely audible above the storm's fury. Caleb's silence lasted so long she felt it settling into her bones like cold. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds that had never properly healed. "Lost them all 8 winters past," he said, each word carved from pain itself. "Wife, boy, everything that made life worth the trouble of living. Fever came through these parts like wildfire, took whole families in a week. I buried them beneath the oak tree by the creek, swore I'd never let anyone else get close enough to hurt me that way again." His arm tightened around Eli's sleeping form. "Thought I'd made my peace with loneliness, until you came stumbling out of that storm like something sent to test my resolve." Eli, half awake in the cocoon of warmth they'd created, mumbled something unintelligible that might have been praise or prayer. Caleb's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile, the first crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. As spring returned with its promise of renewal and its test of survival, Evelyn's muscles hardened from constant labor, her skin bronzed from sun and wind, her eyes sharpened by the daily requirements of frontier existence. Caleb proved to be a demanding but effective teacher, his lessons carved from the kind of hard-won wisdom that meant the difference between life and death in country that forgave no mistakes. She learned to read the sky for signs of approaching weather, to recognize the tracks that meant predators were near, to mend fence with hands that no longer trembled at the bite of wire. He was relentless in his instruction, but patient only with Eli, who absorbed everything like parched earth drinking rain. Day by day, hour by hour, the strange partnership that had begun in desperation evolved into something approaching respect, though the underlying current of possession never disappeared entirely. Eli became the ranch's unexpected joy, his laughter echoing off the walls like music in a tomb. He learned to whittle figures from scraps of wood, to recognize the different calls of birds and the meaning behind each sound, to move with the quiet confidence that came from understanding his place in the dangerous order of things. Caleb was strict with him, but never cruel, teaching him the skills that would keep him alive while allowing him to keep the gentleness that was his birthright. Evelyn, standing over a pot of beans, or hammering a fence post into unforgiving ground, realized she was not only surviving, but changing into something new and strange and powerful. She saw herself reflected in the boy's growing confidence, in the rancher's grudging approval, in the way visiting drovers and trappers treated her with the respect due a woman who had proven herself capable of surviving where weaker souls would perish. But tenderness waited in the wings, forced out only when tragedy loomed with the swiftness of a prairie fire. One harsh spring, when the snow had barely begun to melt and the wind still carried winter's bite, Eli fell ill with a fever that no home remedy could touch. The sickness came without warning, transforming their bright, energetic boy into a fragile creature who burned with internal fire while shivering with uncontrollable chills. Evelyn wept at the thought of losing her child after all she'd sacrificed, all she'd endured to keep him safe. She tried every folk remedy she knew, every prayer she could remember, every desperate bargain with a God who seemed determined to test her beyond human endurance. But the fever raged on, and Eli grew weaker with each passing hour. Caleb watched Evelyn's despair with something approaching anguish in his eyes, then mounted his fastest horse and rode through a spring storm toward Dusty Creek. The journey was treacherous. The roads turned to rivers of mud, but he returned before dawn with Doc Baker and Reverend Cole, both men grim-faced but determined to help. Together, they fought for Eli's life through a night that seemed to last forever. Medicine was administered with steady hands, prayers were offered with fervent hearts, and cool cloths were applied to fevered skin with the desperate gentleness of those who knew how precious life was and how quickly it could slip away. Caleb never left the boy's bedside, his rough hand covering Eli's burning forehead while he whispered words of encouragement in a voice made hoarse by emotion. "Fight like a rancher, son," he murmured, the word son falling from his lips with the weight of a vow. "Fight like you were born to this land and this life. Don't let go." It was the first time he had claimed the boy as his own, and Evelyn felt something shift in her chest like ice breaking up in spring. The fever broke at dawn, Eli's small body finally relaxing into the deep, healing sleep that meant he would live. Evelyn's gratitude was wordless, but profound, her eyes speaking the language that Caleb was finally ready to understand. From that morning forward, the lines between possession and protection, between captivity and partnership, began to blur in ways that would reshape all their lives. The bond between them shifted like sand in wind, possession becoming partnership so gradually that none of them could pinpoint the exact moment when everything changed. Evelyn's resentment faded into something approaching contentment, while Caleb's rigid control softened into the kind of protectiveness that came from love rather than ownership. Rumors traveled faster than any cattle drive in country where news was scarce and gossip was currency. When Evelyn first rode into Dusty Creek beside Caleb, sitting straight-backed on a mare he'd gentled especially for her, the townsfolk reacted with a mixture of curiosity, disapproval, and grudging respect. Mrs. Carmichael, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of public morality, made her scorn known with cutting words and meaningful glances. "Sin against God and nature," she hissed when Evelyn passed, her voice carrying the sharp edge of righteousness. Living in shame with that wild man, setting a terrible example for decent folk. But Evelyn had learned the value of silence, and she did not flinch or respond to provocation that might have destroyed her months before. Caleb's reaction was more direct. He stepped into the space between Evelyn and her accuser with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to violence, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. "I owe this woman everything," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the dusty street. "She kept my ranch running, kept me from losing my mind to grief, kept my boy healthy and strong. You got something to say about that arrangement, you can say it to me." Reverend Cole, a man whose kindness was as genuine as his faith was deep, spoke of forgiveness and new beginnings, of the way God worked through imperfect vessels to achieve his purposes. Eli became a fixture at the town's small school. his wild tales of cattle drives and wolf encounters winning him friends among children whose lives had been shaped by more conventional circumstances. Caleb patrolled the edges of every social gathering, his presence both warning and promise to those who might be tempted to offer insult or injury to the woman he had claimed. His reputation as a man not to be crossed grew with each visit to town, but so did the grudging respect he commanded from those who understood the harsh realities of frontier existence. Ranching gave no quarter to sentiment or weakness. Fences splintered under the weight of winter ice, cattle escaped through gaps that appeared overnight, and storms battered everything that had barely survived the previous season's trials. Evelyn became more than wife or mother. She became the ranch's backbone, trusted by hired hands and respected by the traveling trappers and drovers who stopped to trade or share news from the outside world. Caleb's old hardness softened in ways that were visible only to those who knew him well. He still ruled his domain with an iron hand, but the cruelty had been tempered by something warmer, more human. Evelyn caught him sometimes watching the sunrise from the porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, and she knew he was thinking of the family he'd lost and the family he'd found. One evening, as Evelyn carried water from the well, her arms strong from months of labor, she slipped on stones made treacherous by recent rain. Caleb caught her before she could fall, his hands gentle despite their size and strength, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. Fear for her, for what they'd built together, for the future that suddenly seemed so fragile. That night, in the silence that followed supper and the comfortable routine of evening chores, Caleb made an offer that changed everything between them. His words came slowly, carved from a heart that had forgotten how to hope. "No law here, but what we make together," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You can choose to leave if that's what your heart tells you to do. I'll see you safe to wherever you want to go, give you money enough to start fresh. Or you can stay. Not because I claimed you in desperation, but because you want to build something real with a man who's learned to love again." Evelyn looked out at the endless stretch of stars that had once terrified her with their indifference. Then at the man who had saved her life by offering a bargain that had seemed like damnation at the time. The ranch was theirs now, built by their shared labor and watered with their combined tears. Eli was healthy and strong, sleeping peacefully in the room Caleb had built for him with his own hands. She chose him, not because she had no other options, but because somewhere in the long months of struggle and survival, possession had become partnership, and partnership had become love. Their hands met in the darkness, sealing a promise more important than any legal document or religious ceremony. The bond that had begun in desperation flowered into something that surprised them both with its strength and complexity. They worked side by side as the seasons turned, building a life carved from dust and dreams, shaped by loss, but defined by the hope that they had earned through their willingness to fight for it. Esther, Evelyn's cousin from back east, arrived unexpectedly one autumn day, her traveling dress dusty from the long journey and her face pale with the shock of what she found. She had come expecting to rescue a woman broken by tragedy and degraded by circumstances, but instead found someone transformed by hardship into something stronger and more capable than the sheltered housewife she remembered. "You look so different," Esther said, studying Evelyn's sun-darkened skin and work-calloused hands with something approaching awe. "Like you belong here, like this was always your life." She stayed for 3 days, watching the easy partnership between Evelyn and Caleb, the way they moved together with the unconscious coordination of people who had learned to trust each other completely. When she left, Esther carried stories back east of a woman who had not been broken by the frontier, but forged by it into something new and fierce and beautiful. "She tamed a wild land and a wilder man," she would tell anyone who asked, "and maybe they tamed her right back." Summer arrived on a wave of drought and plenty, the contradictions of Texas weather testing everyone's ability to adapt and survive. It was during the long, hot days of early July that Evelyn realized she was carrying Caleb's child. The discovery filled her with a mixture of joy and terror, the memory of everything that could go wrong in childbirth made sharper by the isolation of their life. Caleb, when she told him, went very still for a long moment before his face transformed with wonder and something approaching reverence. His large hands spread across her still flat belly with the gentleness of a man touching something infinitely precious. "Is it real?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything we've been through, after all the loss and pain, is it really possible?" Evelyn smiled through tears she hadn't expected, understanding that this child represented more than just new life. It was proof that love could grow in the hardest ground, that hope could survive even the cruelest winters. "It's ours," she said simply, "ours by choice and love, not by claim or desperation." The difference was everything, the distinction that transformed their arrangement from something that had begun in darkness into something that could face any future with confidence. Their life together took on new dimensions as they prepared for parenthood. Caleb, who had been careful never to show too much tenderness, now hovered over Evelyn with concern that was both touching and occasionally irritating. He insisted on taking over the heaviest chores, worried constantly about her health, and began building a cradle with the same meticulous care he brought to everything he truly valued. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Tales of the frontier where love is earned through struggle and families are forged in the fires of adversity. The baby was born on a cold February morning, arriving with the strength and stubbornness that seemed to be bred into everyone who called Texas home. Liam Caleb Morgan entered the world with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination, his cries echoing through the ranch house like a declaration of victory over every obstacle they had faced. Caleb wept openly as he held his son for the first time, his tears washing away the last of the walls he had built around his heart after losing his first family. "I never thought I'd have this again," he whispered to Evelyn as she recovered from the birth. "Never thought I deserved another chance at happiness." Evelyn, exhausted but triumphant, reached out to touch his face with fingers that had learned to be gentle again. "We all deserve second chances," she said. "We just have to be brave enough to take them when they come." The years that followed were marked by the kind of steady growth and deepening love that comes to those who have learned to value what they have rather than mourn what they've lost. Eli grew into a young man whose character was shaped by the harsh lessons of frontier life but softened by the security of knowing he was loved and valued. Liam thrived under the attention of his older brother and the careful guidance of parents who understood that children were both blessing and responsibility. The ranch prospered, their hard work and determination gradually transforming raw land into something that could support not just their family but the hired hands and seasonal workers who came to depend on their steady employment and fair treatment. Caleb became known throughout the territory as a man whose word was his bond, whose cattle were the finest stock available, and whose wife commanded the respect of everyone who met her. In town, Evelyn found herself becoming a leader among the women, someone they turned to for advice during difficult times and support when tragedy struck their own families. The woman who had once been scorned as a fallen creature living in sin was now regarded as proof that people could change, that circumstances didn't have to define destiny, and that love could indeed conquer the hardest ground if it was tended with patience and courage. As she sat on the porch of their home one evening, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Evelyn reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and plenty. The woman who had buried her first husband in frozen ground and traded her body for survival seemed like a stranger now, someone from a story she had heard rather than a life she had lived. Caleb joined her as the first stars began to appear, their children's laughter drifting out through the open windows behind them. "Any regrets?" he asked, the question that had haunted both of them finally spoken aloud. Evelyn considered her answer carefully, thinking of all the paths not taken, all the different choices that might have led to different lives. "None," she said finally, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Not a single one. Everything we went through, everything we suffered and survived, it all led us here, to this life, to this love. I wouldn't change any of it, not if it meant losing what we have now. In the distance, a wolf howled its ancient song to the rising moon, but the sound no longer carried any threat. They had made their peace with the wilderness, found their place in the harsh beauty of Texas, and built something strong enough to last through whatever storms might come. Their love story had begun with a desperate bargain, but it had become something far more precious, a testament to the power of human resilience, the possibility of redemption, and the truth that the strongest foundations are built on the bedrock of shared struggle and mutual respect. The ranch would endure, their children would grow and prosper, and their story would become part of the legend of Texas, proof that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings if you have the courage to see them through. Subscribe to this channel and stay with us for more tales of triumph over adversity, where every story cuts to the bone and heals the heart.